The morning I found a 6-foot steel fence cutting through my ranch, I thought someone had made a mistake. 3 days later, I had locked the only road into a luxury neighborhood, and 47 families were demanding to know why they couldn't leave their own community. The funny thing was, they weren't trapped because I took something from them. They were trapped because their HOA took something from me first. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 46 years old, and I own a cattle ranch outside Red Hollow, Texas. It's not the kind of place you see on postcards. There are no perfect lawns, no stone gates, and no people driving around in golf carts checking if someone painted their mailbox the wrong color. My world is dirt roads, open pasture, old fences, and cattle that know exactly when the sun is coming up before I do. This ranch belonged to my father before me, and he spent his whole life teaching me one simple thing. Land isn't just something you own. It's something you take care of. For years, I lived peacefully beside Canyon Ridge Estates, a wealthy neighborhood built just north of my property. I never cared about their expensive homes or fancy cars. People can spend their money however they want. My only concern was that everyone respected where their property ended and mine began. The problem started when the HOA stopped seeing my land as private property and started seeing it as unused space. One morning, while checking my south pasture, I noticed something that immediately felt wrong. A brand new fence was standing where there had only been open grass the day before. It wasn't a small fence either. It was a tall galvanized steel barrier running straight through my pasture, cutting off nearly 10 acres of land and blocking the natural spring my cattle depended on. I got out of my truck and just stared at it. At first, I honestly thought there had to be some explanation. Maybe a contractor had the wrong location. Maybe someone would call and apologize. But nobody called. Nobody asked. Instead, there was a laminated notice attached to one of the posts with the Canyon Ridge HOA logo. It said the fence was part of a community improvement project. I remember laughing when I read that, not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable. They had built a fence on my property and called it an improvement. I called the HOA office immediately. A woman answered and told me the project had already been approved by the board. I asked her, approved by who? Because I'm pretty sure the owner of the land should have been included in that conversation. She became quiet for a moment before saying the area had always been considered a community buffer zone. That was when I realized this wasn't a simple mistake. They genuinely believed they had the right to make decisions about my property. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten anyone. My father always told me that when emotions get loud, paperwork gets quiet. So I went back to my office, opened the old filing cabinet, and started digging through years of documents, deeds, surveys, easement agreements, everything. Hours later, I found the document I needed. The road leading into Canyon Ridge Estates crossed a section of my land, but the agreement came with conditions. They had access, but only under specific terms, and one clause stood out more than anything else. If the primary use of my property was obstructed, the access agreement could be suspended. I looked at the fence. I looked at my cattle standing away from their water source, and I realized something. The HOA thought they had built a barrier to control my land, but they had accidentally given me the exact reason to take back control. I prepared a formal notice explaining the violation and gave them 72 hours to fix the problem. Then I walked into the HOA office and placed it directly in front of their president, Richard Callahan. Richard was the kind of person who was used to being listened to. Expensive suit, confident voice, the kind of man who believed every problem could be solved if you had enough money and the right people in the room. He looked at my notice, smiled, and said, "Mr. Walker, I think you're misunderstanding the situation." I looked at him and replied, "No, Richard, I think you're misunderstanding who owns the land." His smile faded just a little, not much, but enough for me to notice. I walked out of that office knowing the next 72 hours would decide everything, because if Canyon Ridge ignored my notice, I wasn't just dealing with a fence anymore. I was dealing with an HOA that believed rules only applied when they benefited them. And they were about to learn that the quiet rancher they thought they could push around was the one person they should have never underestimated. For the next 3 days, I waited. And honestly, those 3 days were some of the strangest days I had ever experienced on that ranch. Because when you know something is coming, when you know a storm is building, but you can't see the clouds yet, everything feels different. Every truck that drove past my property made me look up. Every phone notification made me wonder if Richard Callahan had finally decided to pick up the phone and admit they were wrong. But nothing happened. Not a single call, not a single apology. Not even a request to discuss the situation. Instead, Canyon Ridge doubled down. They started sending messages to their homeowners telling them the temporary security barrier was part of a planned improvement project and that there was no reason for concern. That was the part that bothered me the most. Not the fence itself, not even the arrogance. It was the fact that they were telling dozens of families everything was fine when they clearly had no idea what they had just done. My grandfather used to say, "The biggest mistake people make is believing confidence is the same thing as being right." And Richard Callahan had confidence. He had plenty of it. What he didn't have was the paperwork. Wednesday morning came around, and at exactly 9:01 a.m., the 72-hour notice expired. I remember standing outside my workshop that morning, looking toward that fence. The sun was just coming up, casting long shadows across the pasture. My coffee was getting cold because I wasn't drinking it. I was thinking, there's a difference between wanting to win an argument and wanting to protect what matters. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I wasn't trying to start some neighborhood war. I just wanted them to understand one simple thing. Respect has to go both ways. So I loaded my truck with a few things I had prepared the night before. Heavy-duty chains, industrial locks, the kind of equipment you don't buy unless you plan on securing something important. I drove to the Eastern Access Road, the same road those Canyon Ridge residents used every day. Then I stepped out, wrapped the chain around the gates, and locked them. It wasn't dramatic. There was no yelling, no crowd, no cameras, just me, standing there on my own property, exercising a right they never thought I had. Before I left, I placed 2 signs on the gate. One said, "Private property." The other explained that access was suspended according to the recorded easement agreement. I took pictures of everything, documented the time, and went home. And then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. About an hour later, I heard the first vehicle, a black electric SUV, pulled up to the gate. The driver stepped out wearing sunglasses, looking confused at first, then angry. He grabbed the chain and pulled on it like somehow frustration could break through steel. It couldn't. "What is this?" he yelled. I was sitting on my porch about 100 yards away, watching the whole thing. He noticed me. "Hey, are you the guy who did this?" I took a sip of coffee and walked closer. "I'm the property owner. You can't just block us in." I looked at him and said, "I didn't block you in. I suspended access to my property after your HOA obstructed my legal land use." He stared at me like I had just spoken another language. Because that's the thing about paperwork. People ignore it until it affects them. Then suddenly, every word matters. "You need to call the HOA," I told him. "They're the ones who thought this was a good idea." He pulled out his phone, started recording, and said something about calling his attorney. I told him he was welcome to. Then I walked back to my porch. I didn't feel victorious. Not yet, because I knew this was only the beginning. The first reaction was always going to be anger. People rarely ask what happened before they ask who to blame. By lunchtime, the neighborhood group chats were probably exploding, and by the next morning, I found out exactly how bad things had become. Thursday was trash collection day in Canyon Ridge. Normally, garbage trucks entered through that access road, collected bins, and left before noon. But without that road, everything changed. 7 garbage trucks lined up near the entrance because they couldn't get through. Residents started walking outside, asking questions. Then, frustration turned into panic. I could see it from a distance. Cars backing up, people standing in driveways, neighbors arguing with neighbors. It was almost unbelievable how quickly a peaceful community could turn chaotic when the convenience they depended on disappeared. By afternoon, the Texas heat was doing what Texas heat does best. The smell started traveling. Hot plastic, old food, rotting leftovers. The kind of smell that reminds you how quickly people forget about basic services until they stop working. One homeowner came to my gate furious. "You're really gonna do this over a fence?" he shouted. I looked at him and said, "No, I'm doing this because your HOA built a fence over my land. They said it was community property." I nodded. "Then they should have no problem showing you the deed." He didn't have an answer, because nobody had shown them anything. They had simply trusted the people in charge, and maybe that was the most uncomfortable part of the whole situation. A lot of those homeowners weren't bad people. They weren't part of the decision. They were just people who believed the people with titles and meetings and fancy offices always knew what they were doing. But sometimes the people with the most authority are the ones who have stopped listening. Later that afternoon, things escalated. A younger man from the neighborhood decided he was done waiting. He walked toward the fence line and started trying to climb over. I watched him for a moment, hoping he would stop. He didn't, so I called the sheriff's office. When the deputy arrived, I showed him the documents, the notices, the photos, everything. He looked through the paperwork carefully. Then he looked at the fence. Then he looked back at me. "So they built this without permission?" he asked. "That's what the records show." He nodded slowly. "You handled this the right way. You documented everything. That mattered to me more than people probably realize, because when you're standing alone against a powerful organization, you start wondering if anyone will believe you." The next morning, I finally got the call I had been expecting. Richard Callahan wanted to meet. He didn't sound confident anymore. He sounded tired. The meeting happened at my ranch gate, and when he arrived, he wasn't alone. He brought 2 HOA board members and their attorney. Funny thing about confidence, it disappears quickly when there's no audience cheering for you anymore. Richard stepped out of his SUV and looked at the locked gate. "Ethan, this has gone too far." I almost smiled, because that sentence was interesting coming from the man who started everything. "You built a fence across my pasture," I said. "You blocked my water source. You ignored my notice. And now you're telling me it went too far?" His attorney stepped forward. "We believe the HOA acted within its understanding of the community boundaries." I handed him a copy of the survey. "Your understanding doesn't change recorded property lines." Richard looked uncomfortable. He wasn't used to this. He was used to homeowners complaining about paint colors and parking violations. He wasn't used to someone showing up with decades-old documents that could shut down his entire plan. "What do you want?" he finally asked. That was the first honest question anyone from Canyon Ridge had asked me. I looked past him toward the fence cutting to my pasture. I thought about my father. I thought about those cattle standing without access to the spring, and I realized this wasn't just about removing a fence anymore. It was about making sure they never looked at someone else's property and thought they could simply take control. "First," I said, "the fence comes down." Richard nodded slowly. "And second?" I reached into my folder and pulled out one final document. "Second, we discussed compensation." His expression changed. "Compensation?" I nodded. "For damages, for repairs, for legal expenses, and for the fact that your HOA treated my land like a blank space on your map." His attorney took the paper and started reading. The number at the top was clear, $143,000. The room went quiet. Richard looked at me like he couldn't decide whether to be angry or shocked. "You're asking us for $143,000? I looked him straight in the eye. "No, I'm presenting the cost of fixing what your HOA broke." For the first time since this started, Richard Callahan had no immediate answer. The man who thought he controlled an entire neighborhood was standing at my gate realizing something he should have understood 3 days earlier. Sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one person who actually knows the rules. But what happened next was something even I didn't expect, because the HOA wasn't just going to pay the bill and walk away. They had one more move, and that move was about to reveal exactly how far they were willing to go to avoid admitting they were wrong. Richard Callahan stood there at my gate for a long moment, staring at the documents in his hands like they had somehow changed since the last time he saw them. But they hadn't. The words were the same. The property lines were the same. The easement terms were the same. The only thing that had changed was that now those words mattered to him. A week earlier, those papers were just something from an old filing cabinet on a ranch he thought he could ignore. Now, they were the reason his entire neighborhood was demanding answers, and I could see it on his face. He finally understood that the biggest mistake he made wasn't building the fence. The biggest mistake was believing I wouldn't fight back. The next HOA meeting became something nobody in Canyon Ridge expected. Homeowners who once supported Richard were now standing up and asking questions. They wanted to know why nobody checked the survey before approving the project. They wanted to know why they were told the fence was legal when nobody had ever spoken to the actual landowner. And most importantly, they wanted to know how much this mistake was going to cost them. Richard tried to explain. He talked about misunderstandings, outdated records, and communication issues. But those words didn't mean much anymore, because everyone had seen what happened when people with authority stopped listening. The truth had a way of becoming louder than any excuse. A few days later, Richard came back to my ranch. This time he didn't arrive with lawyers or board members. He came alone. He stepped out of his truck, looked across the pasture, and for the first time since I met him, he looked less like a man in charge and more like a man who realized he had made a very expensive mistake. "Ethan," he said, I owe you an apology. I didn't answer right away. I just looked toward the spring where my cattle were finally drinking again. That little stream had been there long before Canyon Ridge existed, long before their gates, their stone walls, and their community rules. You know what bothered me the most? I finally said. It wasn't the fence. It wasn't even the damage. It was that nobody thought they needed to ask. Richard looked down, because he knew I was right. The entire conflict could have been avoided with one conversation, one phone call, one person deciding that another person's property deserved respect. Instead, they chose paperwork from a homeowners association office over the reality standing right in front of them. We eventually reached an agreement. The HOA paid for the damage, the repairs, the legal expenses, and the disruption caused to my ranch operation. The fence came down. The access agreement was rewritten with clear rules that protected both sides. No more assumptions. No more gray areas. No more pretending that owning a big house gave someone the right to make decisions about land they didn't own. The day the fence was removed, I stood there watching the workers pull out every single post they had planted. It was strangely quiet. No shouting, no arguments, just the sound of metal coming loose from the ground. And honestly, that moment felt better than any check they could have written me, because what I wanted from the beginning wasn't their money. It was recognition. Recognition that my land mattered, that my family's history mattered. That being a rancher didn't mean I was someone they could ignore. Before the crew left, one of the Canyon Ridge homeowners walked over to me. His name was David Parker. He was the same guy who had yelled at me during the first day at the gate. He looked uncomfortable, almost embarrassed. "I owe you an apology," he said. I asked him why. He looked back at the neighborhood behind him and said, "Because I believed the HOA before I ever bothered to ask what actually happened." I appreciated that. Because mistakes happen, people make bad decisions. But the difference between good people and bad situations is whether someone is willing to admit when they were wrong. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun disappear behind the pasture. The same porch where I had watched angry neighbors arrive. The same land where I had found that fence cutting through my property. But everything looked different now. The cattle were calm. The spring was flowing. The ranch was quiet again. And I realized something. This was never really about a fence or a road. It was about what happens when people forget that respect cannot be bought. You can buy a bigger house. You can buy a nicer car. You can hire expensive lawyers. But none of that gives you the right to take something that belongs to someone else. Sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the person who knows the rules better than anyone else. And sometimes the quiet person standing on their own land is the one person you should have never tried to push around. So now I want to hear what you think. Was I right to lock the road after the HOA built that fence across my property? Or should I have handled things differently? Do you think the HOA crossed a line? Or do you think I went too far by forcing them to face the consequences? Let me know in the comments, because situations like this always divide people. Some believe property rights are absolute. Others believe neighbors should always find a way to compromise. Tell me where you're watching from. Share your own experience with difficult neighbors or community rules. And let's talk about it. Because sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought over money. They're fought over something much simpler: respect.